Dr. Chen-Ning Yang, a Nobel laureate in physics, is the Albert Einstein Professor Emeritus in Physics at Stony Brook University and the founding director of the C.N. Yang Institute for Theoretical Physics at Stony Brook. His good friend, Dr. James Harris Simons, is a renowned mathematician, investment advisor, and philanthropist. A former chair of the math department at Stony Brook, he heads Renaissance Technologies, an investment fund that trades billions of dollars in markets around the world. He and his wife Marilyn recently donated $60 million to Stony Brook to create the Simons Center for Geometry and Physics. And gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be able to speak to both of you. I was quite comforted yesterday to learn that each of you at certain points in your relationship were unable to understand what the other one was talking about. I found that a very comforting situation. Now that physics and math are back together again, is everybody caught up with each other, Dr. Simons?
Well, I still, generally speaking, don't understand a heck of a lot of physics. So I don't know. I think a lot of mathematicians have certainly caught up to some extent. People who are interested in these particular areas, which do center around geometry to a large extent, have gotten more familiar with the physics lingo, at least, and what they're after in many respects. And I expect the same is true on the physics side.
How about Dr. Young? Do you now understand what the mathematicians are talking about?
Mostly not. But let me explain. Math and physics, and in fact every discipline, has now become very big subjects of investigation. In contrast to 100 years ago, each covers now much broader territory than before. So when a mathematician talks to me, most of the time I cannot understand. But the amazing thing is that between what they talk about and what we talk about, there's a region of overlap. What is amazing is this region of overlap is very, very fundamental. And it's mostly related to the geometry part of mathematics. So although it is only a small fraction of both mathematics and physics, it occupies an essential position in both, sort of at the source of the lifeblood of each. And everybody expects, both mathematicians and physicists expect that this will continue, that the future developments of both disciplines are likely to be deeply entangled in this central region. And that is the reason why everybody is very happy that with Jim and Marilyn's generosity, Stony Brook will be able to launch into this central area of research for both disciplines.
I want to follow up on that, but I also want to mention that I heard you say at one point you wrote that there were two types of mathematics books. Tell me about that.
Yes, that was when in 1969 or thereabouts, I found some similarity between some mathematicians' formula and some formula that we physicists were talking about. So I went to Jim, who was department chairman of math at that time, and he instantly said, these are the same thing in fiber bundles. So I said, what's fiber bundles? So he gave me a book, a very famous book written by a Princeton mathematician named Steinrod. And I took the book back and got very frustrated after studying it for a couple of hours. So later I joked there are only two types of modern mathematics book. One you cannot read beyond the first page, and one you cannot read beyond the first sentence. And the Steinrod's was the latter kind. And the mathematicians agree that they think that this is an appropriate joke to a certain extent. But that does not mean that they would abandon that style. There is a certain rigidity, but there is certain advantage in this way of writing. So some of the mathematicians persist in writing that way.
Is that the way you would write, Dr. Simons? Are you rigid?
Steenrod's book was always not an easy read. Some people are better writers than others, and as time goes on, certain fields become clarified and then, as a result, easier to explain. So I never got very far in Steenrod's book either, and learned that material that's in that book in other ways. But Steenrod's book was written sometime earlier, well before I gave it to Frank. So it's like a lot of subjects. At first, they're very difficult to understand and therefore difficult to explain to other people because you don't perhaps fully understand all the ramifications yourself. Gradually, things become clearer, and things are easy to explain. So, you know, that's Steenrod's book. I think will always be a particular example of something that's pretty hard to read.
Is fiber bundle something that you could explain fairly easily at this point?
I could if I had 10 minutes.
I see.
You want to give me 10 minutes?
I'll give you 10 minutes after this interview.
Fine.
You're funding the Simon Center for Geometry and Physics. What do you hope and expect will happen there? And to get back to something that Dr. Young said, what is the connection between geometry and physics that doesn't connect the rest of mathematics?
Well, obviously, most of mathematics is involved in physics. Calculus is involved in physics, and you have to know how to solve linear equations or whatever, so inverted matrix, all that stuff. Most basic mathematics, or a great deal of it, finds its way into physics and is necessary. The modern thrust of mathematics into geometry, which has occurred over the last, say, 75 to 100 years by now, has very much deepened a certain area of mathematics, which is generally called geometry. And those areas have become particularly relevant in physics. So, and physics has always had quite a bent towards the geometric side of mathematics. For example, if you look at the work of Archimedes, who was a great scientist, the more I've learned about him, the greater he seems. He did both mathematics and physics. I don't think completely separated the two in his mind. For example, he quickly learned how the importance of the center of mass. Now, he was only looking, at least initially, at the center of mass of a two-dimensional object, of a flat object, which you might think, well, doesn't even have any mass. But, of course, if it's a little thin plate of metal or something. So, geometrically, you find a nice formula for the center of mass. Well, you couldn't do physics without the notion of the center of mass. Elementary physics, that's the way you look at forces that are applied to the center of mass, and then the whole thing becomes simple. So, from the very beginning, at least back to Archimedes, geometry, the geometric side of mathematics and physics were quite intertwined. Newton himself did a lot of his work with geometric, stimulation and inspiration, and his writings involved a lot of geometry and depended on that quite a lot for the physical intuition. So there's nothing really new about a geometry and physics interaction, except how these very advanced areas of both subjects have become so intertwined in the past, say, 40 years. Yes.
Let me supplement what Jim just said.
Please.
As he said, traditionally, physics and mathematics had deep relations, especially physics with geometry. And in the 19th century, Maxwell wrote down Maxwell's equations. That's the greatest piece of physics in the 19th century. And if you read what he wrote, he was thinking deeply geometrically. However, the person who explicitly stated that the physics has to be geometrized was Einstein. Einstein first did this in the beginning of the 20th century by geometrizing the concept of gravity. Gravity used to be thought of as something that two bodies would attract each other at a distance, and that's started from Newton's times. Einstein converted that into a geometrical theory, a completely geometrical theory, and that's called general relativity. That's one of his great achievements. More than that, after that, he then said that not only should gravity be geometrized, as I did, but other forces in nature should also be geometrized. What is meant by the other forces of nature at that time? It means electromagnetism, electric and magnetic forces. Electric magnetic forces used to be thought of, you have a charge here, you have a charge here, they repair each other if they have the same signs. Like Newton's gravity, action at a distance. And Einstein insisted that this kind of electromagnetic forces should also become geometrical. And that was the beginning of the idea of gauge theory, taken up by one of the great mathematicians of the 20th century, Hermann Weyl. And he introduced the idea of gauge theory, which developed through all these ages to today, and it has a profound influence on the re-emergence of a common interest between the geometers and the physicists.
In many ways, you two gentlemen represent this coming together of
I would say
physics and mathematics.
We contributed to the beginning of it.
Tell me about
Would
that.
you agree with that?
Yeah, I think we contributed to the beginning of
Tell
it.
me about that.
Well, from my point of view, when I came to Stony Brook, Frank was good enough to tell me some of the things that he was doing, and since I knew so little physics, they went right over my head. But at a certain point, I realized that what he was doing involved mathematics very similar to what I was doing, or at least where I'd come from. He was depending or groping, in some cases, for mathematics which had been done 30 or 40 years earlier. And that was, at that point, I realized, hey, you know, we're using different words to say some of the same things and so on and so forth. So I got interested in, to some extent, in sort of interpreting some of these things to Frank and his colleagues. And he also told me about an extraordinary experiment called the Bohm-Aharonov experiment, which that would only take me 3 minutes to describe.
Oh.
Well, it's basically an experiment where you expect nothing to happen. Intuitively, you'd expect nothing to happen, and in fact, something happens. A coherent beam of electrons, you know, all with their frequencies lined up, you know, coherent light like lasers, is sent around a circle by reflecting it and comes back and meets itself. In the presence of a magnetic field, you would expect that there'd be a twist, but the coherence would be shifted as a result of this magnetic field, let's say, that they're going through. But it turns out that these fellows, Bohm and Aharonov, did an experiment where there was no magnetic field present that the electrons could detect. It was confined, let's say, to a region way away from where the electrons were. So, but the electrons, if they had a brain, would not feel anything. They would just march around very happily and come back and find themselves upside down relative to their friends who were just coming, you know, whom they were meeting. And that was quite extraordinary. On the other hand, the geometric description of that kind of phenomena, that kind of a twist, is well described. It's called a flat bundle, or a flat connection on a bundle, one of these fiber bundles that would take me too long to describe. So that made me realize, hey, here's this remarkable phenomenon in physics, which mathematically is trivially described in using modern mathematics. And I told this to a few of my other mathematical friends, for example, Singer from MIT, who communicated, and he got excited, and he communicated this to Atiyah and some other very prominent mathematicians with whom he was working. And so they at least began looking at some of the issues in physics that their approach to geometry and topology could be applied to. I think at the same time that Frank and I were talking, I expect there were others who were having the same kinds of discussions. I don't think we were unique in getting this going. It was the time was ripe, and so I'm sure there were others who were getting involved. Within a few years, I decided to try to make some money, and stopped.
How'd that work out for you, by the way?
Fine.
Good. Sorry. Go ahead.
You didn't ask Jim whether his ability to make money is related to geometry.
Yeah, you could ask me that.
And I intend to.
And it isn't.
I was wondering whether you had discovered some secret formula.
No secret formula
for producing things in the marketplace. Well, to get back to the center which you are funding, what do you expect out of that?
I expect good science. I think because of the focus, we have a chance to see some very interesting developments there. I think I did it for one thing because we did it because we wanted to make a gift to Stony Brook. I feel Stony Brook gave us a lot, and we were going to make a gift to Stony Brook of some sort or another in connection with their capital campaign. But this subject I began to realize this would be an excellent thing to use that money for. So we focused on this, and I'm hoping great results come, and a lot of people get trained, and it becomes a fount of knowledge in this area.
And you must be very interested in that.
Yeah. Please allow me to supplement what Jim said. From the physics side, in the 20th century, starting with Einstein, Heisenberg, Bohr, through several revolutions, there was great progress. However, there is one nagging difficult problem, and that is how to put gravity and the quantum mechanics together. Gravity and quantum mechanics are both essential theoretical and experimentally important ideas and concepts, and the theory behind them must be put together, otherwise the whole of physics is sort of not exactly matched up. But we met with great difficulties in putting the two together, and this is the main subject in fundamental theoretical physics in the last 30 years. And in the last 30 years, one bright idea took place. It's called superstrings, or string theory. Mm-hmm. So string theory now attracts, I would say, at least 1/3 of all the brightest young PhDs in theoretical physics. It is the hottest field in the last 30 years. And string theory is deeply entangled with deep mathematics, and especially with deep geometrical and topological mathematics. And that must be one of the reasons in the back of Jim's mind in funding this center, because this center would concentrate on deep geometrical, topological problems, which many of which came from the string theorists. So I would presume that when they make appointments in the center, there would be people who would be working in geometry, who would be working in string theory, and who would be working in between the two.
Those are the appointments you'll be making?
Primarily. There'll be, there'll be a faculty of 7 a director and 6 faculty members, permanent members, and then about 30 visitors every year. And many of the visitors, and perhaps most or even all of the faculty, might be as Frank described. But there'll be other, and always have been, strong interactions between even the geometric side of mathematics and physics. So I think we don't want to be known as a string theory institute per se. String theory has come. There may be other theories that develop along the line, and we want to stick to, I think, the geometrical side of things, which is a very, very broad statement. But string theory and those problems in physics that relate to that, which are going to be many, right now string theory is, as Frank says, the hot thing. But it's morphing too. I mean, you know, what was string theory 20 years ago might not be recognized. I mean, it's developing, and there are experiments now being done in the new collider at CERN when it opens. I don't know if you know about this huge accelerator that will go online next year, maybe. I'm not sure.
Perhaps if they do not get more funding problems.
Okay, well, I ran to the rescue of Rick, but I don't think I'm going to run to the rescue of CERN, so they're going to have to figure that one out for themselves.
You ran to the rescue of the one at Brookhaven National Lab.
Yeah, I did.
You did.
But CERN is of a high enough energy, and Frank can obviously say much more about that than I, but that at the edge of those energy levels, certain conjectures, I think supersymmetry is one, might be verified. So certain things in modern physics, in particular in string theory, might have some experimental justification as a result of experiments there. Frank, you must be able to say more than...
Yeah, well, we are all looking forward to what will come out of what is called the LHC at CERN, which probably would come working, if not this year, next year. And one of the crucial questions is whether they will find a particle called Higgs particle. The good thing about it is that
Higgs,
Higgs is an Englishman. If they find the Higgs particle, it will be very good. If they do not find the Higgs particle, in my opinion, it will be even better. Why? Because all the theories converge to the Higgs particle, and if it exists, everything is smoothed out. Everything is very good. If it doesn't, it means that we are going the wrong channel. We have to completely rethink. That means there may be a revolution coming. So in many senses, that is even better. But anyway, it's
Frank's a revolutionary, you see. He likes revolution for its own sake.
No, but the reason Einstein is so famous is because he personally created 2.5 revolutions. So if you talk to a bright young physicist, he would like to have more revolutions rather than not. But anyway, the CERN event is a very important one. So we are all looking forward to that. No matter which way it turns out, it means that we will have more material to think about, and it's clear that those material would be in between would be in between geometry and physics.
And it will prove it one way or the other when it.
Yes.
Yeah, that should. And there are other things too, I think, that are other results that could. I think there's a lot that could come out of CERN.
Have they already asked you to rescue them?
No.
Not yet.
No. I'm not.
Don't be opening the
I'm
mail.
not advertising my availability either. That's a big project.
Let somebody else open your mail for you.
I want to say something about what Frank said about geometry dictating things. As Frank said, the general relativity said, look, the universe, four-dimensional universe, including time, has a shape to it. It's not flat. It has a shape, and that there's more bending in the presence of more mass and less bending in the presence of less mass, and that bending is what causes things to come together, like rolling down a channel or something like that. So the geometry forces the physics, or in a sense determines the physics. And that's, as Frank said, you know, it was a fabulous development. Now, those are very macro things. You're looking across billions and billions of miles and so on. So now, if you go to the opposite time, space scale, look very, 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 very small. Look at distances of, you know, 1/10 with 30 zeros, really small. There may be geometry going on at that scale. There may be some interesting geometry at that scale. In fact, there seems very likely to be. And a scale that is undetectable, obviously, as we're sitting here by us, but nonetheless, there may be something going on way, 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 way down there. So that I think it was Wheeler who first sort of hypothesized maybe space is sort of a foam-like thing. And at the very smallest space scales, there may be little bubbles or this, that, or the other thing. To the extent that something like that is true, then you might end up with a situation where the microgeometry of space drives quantum mechanics or some of the other physics. So it's possible that Einstein's dream, or Einstein's approach to geometry explaining the physics, could even end up at the micro scale. And again, I emphasize, I really mean a micro scale. That the geometry there could also perhaps simplify or drive the physics. You have a thought on that?
Yes. In general, there's some speculation about this. As I said, there's the question of how to marry gravity with quantum mechanics. And when you talk about that, these extremely small regions immediately come into play, obviously. How that is going to play out is everybody's speculation. And that is deeply entangled with this string theory also.
For sure, for sure.
I wanted to mention one thing about your background that came to mind when we were describing Dr. Young as a revolutionary here, but which was your getting fired from the government, which was pretty much the reason you came to Stony Brook to begin with. Tell me about that.
Well, it was simple enough. I was at I'd spent 4 years in Princeton at something called the Institute for Defense Analyses, which was a place that specialized, was a government agency or contracted to a government agency, the NSA, in fact. And they hired mathematicians there to work on very high-level, secret, obviously, codes, try to help the United States make more secure codes and try to crack Russian codes, for example, and so on. They hired mathematicians. The deal was you could spend half your time doing research on your own and half your time working on the government problem, so it was nice. And I took that job for a variety of reasons, went to Princeton. And I was an okay code cracker. And I also did a fair amount of mathematics while I was there. And in fact, the work that I did there justified Stony Brook giving me that offer because I had solved an old, well-known problem. But in the meantime, I was, you know, being a code cracker. And, but the Vietnam War was heating up and I didn't like it and I was outspoken about it. We weren't doing any work that impinged on the war. We were working on very high-level Russian cipher systems, and I think there was no application at all to Vietnam. My view was it was a dumb place for us to be, and we ought to get out of there. The head of the Institute for Defense Analysis was Maxwell Taylor, a man you may have remembered. Good old General Max. Mm-hmm. And he published an article. There was a cover story in the New York Times magazine, Sunday magazine, saying how wonderfully we're doing in Vietnam, and we just stay the course. Why we'll defeat the enemy. And I wrote a letter to the Times, which they published, saying not everyone who works for General Taylor subscribes to his view, and then I went on and gave my own view. So that sort of sat there like a lump. Nobody said anything for 6 months. And then I was really a wise guy in those days, and a reporter, or a guy who was purported to be a reporter, he was a stringer, in fact, for Newsweek, the magazine, said he's doing a story on people who work for the Defense Department who were opposed to the war. Could I interview you? What are you doing about this? I said, well, as a policy at IDA, you can spend 50% of your time on your own mathematics and 50% of your time cracking codes or whatever they do there. I'm not even sure I said that. And my algorithm lately has been, I'm spending all of my time in mathematics, and when the war is over, I'll spend an equal amount of time on their work, so but I'll have matched it all up, see? So I said that to him. Then I went back to the office, and it occurred to me maybe I better tell my boss that I gave this interview. It was the only intelligent thought I'd had all day, but it came a little late. So I said, you know, I gave this interview. He said, gee, I better tell Taylor. He calls Taylor. Taylor said, fire him, and I was fired. So that was that. It happened. It happened in what seemed to me to be a microsecond. And the funny thing is that 3 days later, Lyndon Johnson announced he was not going to run for a second term. He was going to stop the bombing, and I figured the war was over. So I went back to my local boss, a very nice fellow, and I said, you know, why don't we just forget about all this? I mean, this whole damn thing is over. And he said, I don't think so. I needed a job. And I wasn't very worried about finding a job because, you know, I was obviously competent as a research mathematician, so something would come up. But the Stony Brook was very appealing to me, to be a chairman. I thought that would be a lot of fun, and it was. Mm-hmm. It was.
That was in retrospect, all that was a good thing that happened to you.
I think it was a very good thing, yeah. Sure. I met Frank, I met my wife, all kinds of good things happened.
What was it about that war that you didn't like?
Well,
was it any war or just that one?
No, it's not any war. I think I would have been in favor of our fighting in the Second World War and so on. It's usually the example that everyone agrees is a justified war. I didn't think that there was such a big threat from the communists over there. I thought we were losing an awful lot of people. I thought we were taking our eyes off the ball that in America. It just seemed like a waste and very destructive, and you could feel the fabric of society tearing apart as the kids were marching and bodies were coming home, and we weren't getting anywhere. So it just seemed stupid to me. So,
some year 68 was.
It was a heck of a year, yeah. It was a heck of a year.
And after Jim came, after I got acquainted with him, one day he came to me and said, let's organize an anti-war fund. And so we did, and I talked about that last night, and also Irving Krah talked about that. We raised a lot of money, I forgot how much, to contribute to the anti-war effort. And in fact, at that time, we raised more money on this campus than on any other campus in the United States. All these anti-war funds drives was springing up on all campuses, and much larger campuses like Berkeley and Michigan did not raise as much money as we did here.
Well, I mean,
and I think that I was saying something else, that Frank's agreeing to co-head that made a huge difference because, first of all, he had such respect in the university, and second of all, I think he was taking some risk because, you know, he was a Chinese guy and maybe had relative. I mean, I don't know, but I think he was taking some risk.
It's true, because the U.S. has always been, some people in the U.S. government is a little bit always suspicious of me, because my field is physics, deeply related to nuclear physics. Edward Teller was my thesis advisor.
Right.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And I was close to Oppenheimer.
Oppenheimer,
so I'm sure the CIA has my files this thick. And then in 1971, I visited China for the first time. The reason that I informed the
Communist China, we might say.
Right.
What was known then as Communist China.
China and the U.S. fought a war in first two wars, in fact. First in Korea, then in Vietnam. And in 71, I was able to visit because with the ping-pong diplomacy, I can tell that Nixon and Mao wanted to talk to each other because both of them were afraid of the Soviet Union. And so I decided to visit. And after I decided that, I decided that it's not good if I do not tell the White House. So I wrote to the science advisor, David, Mr. David.
Ed David.
Do you know him?
Yeah, I don't know him well, but I know him.
He visited me in Tsinghua 2 years ago. But anyway, I wrote to him. And to my surprise, he answered saying that we are delighted that you are going to visit China, but we cannot help you to get a visa. Now, I didn't need the help. I had already written to my father, and my father applied to the Chinese government, and then they said, fine, ask your son to get the visa, the Chinese visa, in the Chinese embassy in Paris. There was only 2 Chinese embassies in Western countries, in Ottawa and in Paris. So I got it in Paris, and after I came back, immediately the CIA visited me several times. I told them I pay U.S. taxes. I'm a U.S. citizen. I do not do anything that's unlawful. But I was very careful.
Yeah, so...
because what happened is the following. The CIA man came, or rather he called, and he insisted on visiting me in my house, which is on Daniel Webster. I didn't know why. I said, why don't we just go to my office? No. He wanted to be in my house. So the more he insisted, the more I declined that. So finally, he came to my office. And after a few minutes of conversation, 2 of them came. And they, as soon as we sat down in my office on a table, they immediately opened their file and took out some documents. I become alerted because I already know that this is the way they trap people. If they can eventually say that you had seen some secret document. So I said, hold on. I got my secretary to come in, to sit there. And later she signed an affidavit saying that she was there when throughout the conversation I had with the CIA man. Because I told the CIA man, my parents are in China, and I still want to visit them. I do not want to be entangled with any secret stuff in the United States which may prevent my legally going to China again. And that was a very clever move. And the next day, I called the NSF. We had a contract with the NSF.
NSF?
The NSF did not know about this. There was a man named, I forgot, who was in charge of the Stony Brook grant. So I called him, and he said, great, here investigate. Then after a couple of hours, he called me, and he said, you did a very intelligent thing by telling me about this. Because in Washington, there are many branches, and they are not informing each other. And if the NSF didn't know that the CIA man had visited me, there may be some confusion which put the NSF sort of in a bad light. By my telling the NSF immediately about this, they were in a stronger position. Well, I understand that the CIA has its job, because clearly China also has agents here, and just like the U.S. has agents. The world is very complicated. What one has to be careful about is not to get entangled, not to get suckered into things like this.
Yeah, well, that was very interesting.
Yeah, I remember I did a very famous Watergate story like that, where one of the Watergate guys went to Judge Sirica in his chambers and said, I've got this document I want to give you, and the judge, no, and called in a court reporter, a stenographer, to record everything that took place with the passing of that document.
Yeah, well, that was very good. Anyway, there was a great success raising that money, and I think Frank was quite courageous to have taken on the publicly visible post of, co-head of this thing, and it worked out fine.
It naturally raises the next question, which is how you feel, either of you, if you feel strongly at all about what's going on now with the so-called war on terror. Does that disturb you as much as Vietnam did, Dr. Simons?
Well, I think the Iraq War was a terrible mistake. You know, we're not bringing back as many dead people from it. So in that sense, and it hasn't caused the furor, the dislocations that Vietnam did. On the other hand, I think it's definitely one of the worst pieces of public policy I ever saw. I think we were suckered into it. I think we were misled by the administration. If there really were a bunch of atomic bombs over there, okay, but there weren't, and they knew there weren't. So I feel misled, and now we have to figure out a way to wind that down and get the heck out of there. But it isn't simple. I mean, we can't. I don't think we can just say goodbye suddenly. We've created such a mess. We have to clean it up somehow or other. But it was a bad business. Anyway, that's what I think. Frank, maybe you have a different view.
I think it's clear that with the coming election, the new president will try to extract the U.S. from the mess in Iraq. Whatever the original reason, whatever the original strategy, it is clear that what has happened created tension in the United States and weakened the U.S. Internationally. So something has to be done. Of course, how to do it is a complicated. It's a little bit like the Vietnam War. How to solve this problem would be, I think, the chief responsibility of the next president.
You spend a lot of time in China now. How is the relationship between China and the U.S. developing, in your opinion?
I think it's going very well. I think in the first place, I moved back to China. Actually, I've been going back to China back and forth repeatedly, but in 2003, after my first wife died, I moved back completely. So now I spend almost 10 months, 11 months in China and Shanghai and Hong Kong, and only visit the U.S. occasionally. And I can see within the last 5 years, there has been an enormous change in A, China's position in the world, and B, the relationship between the Chinese government and Washington. And all of this, in my opinion, are for the good for international relations. The most obvious thing is about North Vietnam and North Korea. You know, this six-sided talk was initiated by the Chinese side, and it's clear it has not yet been successful, but it has already accomplished a lot. And I think it's everybody believes, I think everybody, including the North Koreans, that this is the way to go. Despite all the difficulties, it's making steady, although slow, progress. And without this, it could be very disruptive, could have led to a disastrous war. So I'm sure President Bush is very appreciative of this. There are, of course, lots of frictions. A country as large as China, which is trying to pull itself out of poverty, meets with tremendous problems. I have said publicly that what China is trying to do is to compress in 40 years the progress made by the West in 400 years. And of course, when you do it with such a rate, it's bound to create problems. By the way, I should say here, and I told a story last night, I asked Jim to visit me in China in 2001, and Jim and Marilyn came. And afterwards, I saw him in Sitoket, and I was very impressed with the short conversation I had with him. I said, Jim, how's your impression of China? It's his first visit. And he sort of paused for a few seconds. I realized that this has been on his mind, and he said, well, I think the problem facing the world today, the most important problem facing the world today, is poverty. And he said, here in my visit I found 1.3 billion people pulling themselves up out of poverty by their own bootstraps. And that is a contribution not only to themselves, but also to the world. I think it's very clear that that reflects the thinking of a thoughtful person who, upon reaching a stage in his life when he can try to do something good for mankind, not just for himself, would perhaps think about. So I was deeply impressed by that statement.
Okay.
Dr. Simons, you've been involved in a number of philanthropic efforts, including healthcare in Nepal, including, of course, all the help you've given here to Stony Brook and to the Brookhaven National Lab. Tell us a little bit about philanthropy and how you go about making the decisions that you do.
Well, the biggest single focus we have right now, we have a number of foci, but first of all, our foundation and our philanthropy is primarily based on scientific research. That is, supporting mathematics and science basic research. That's what and we spend 80% of our funds on that. One thing you didn't mention is the autism
right.
initiative that we have, and that's probably the biggest single project we have, and there we're quite focused, and we've put up a team under the leadership of Jerry Fishbach, who's a well-known neuroscientist, and to run that, and we're trying to make some progress with that condition, which really goes to the heart of, in many respects, of how the brain works. Understanding that condition is going to end up giving us a lot of understanding about how a normal brain, an unaffected brain works. And so it's quite scientifically very challenging. But basically, our approach is to support basic scientific and mathematical research for two reasons. One, because we think there's a lot of leverage in that one can do a lot of good by making progress in these basic kinds of areas. And two, it's interesting to both Marilyn and me. We both like research. I get into it a little bit. I've learned some neuroscience. Obviously, I'm a mathematician, so maybe I could get into a little bit about what we're doing here. But so it appeals to us aesthetically as something very interesting and something we both like, and from the first point of view.
Autism is, of course, a very important subject now. There's very little known about it, isn't that?
Well, of course, if everything was known about it, then it wouldn't be such a problem. It's genetic, that's for sure. Two identical twins, if one has it, the other is 90% going to have it. So at least beyond the spectrum, it's a broad range of conditions that have a number of things in common. So the first fact is it's genetic. The second fact, and now we've been looking for genes. There's going to be a large set of genes that impinge on this, probably at least 50 from different places in the genome that are going to create what's called autism. Presumably many of these affecting the same pathway or the same subsystem. In other words, there are a lot of things that can make a car go wrong, not drive. Maybe the spark plugs are no good, or the carburetor is no good, or this or that. Any of them relates in a poor performance of the car, but they may be different things. So, and most of these genes, the genetic condition is probably going to be turn out to be what's called sporadic. In other words, you don't inherit it from your mother, let's say. It's not found in her genome, but it might be a damage in her egg, or perhaps more likely in your father's sperm. So there could be, at the germ cell level, some damage at the time of inception, some genetic damage, which then becomes infant's genome, and so it's not classically Mendelianly inherited. You don't say, oh yes, well, old Uncle Ned had it and he was passed down and so on and so forth. That'll happen, but most of it is probably going to end up being this. So there's a big hunt on for genes. We're doing a big data collection at 11 sites around the world, collecting uniformly characterized genetic information, bloods and so on, and a lot of questionnaire type stuff, phenotype information. So that's a project that we're doing. And I'm very optimistic that within 3 years, I would say, most of the gene candidates will have been identified, and some discovery will have been made already as to how a few of these major ones work. There are already some mouse models being made of a couple of the most flagrant suspects, and so I think that the next 3 years is going to see a lot of progress. I think the next 5 years. I think within 5 or 6 years there may be some interventions based on what we've learned here, something to stimulate or slow down some particular process that's inhibited or accelerated or whatever it might be. So, and it will break down into subgroups. Even though there's 50 or maybe even 100 genes, there's probably a half a dozen subtypes that come out. I mean, there's a lot to be learned. There's a lot to be learned.
You sound very hopeful, though. I mean, that's
I'm very
the most
hopeful.
optimistic assessment of autism I've ever heard.
Well, I'm very, very hopeful. I mean, I think there's a clear path. It's genetic, let's find the genes. Find the genes, let's see what they do. There's a clear path. There will be progress on this path. Will it be wiped out or 100% treatable? I doubt it very much. Will a reasonable amount of it be treatable? I'm optimistic.
You reject the fairly widespread notion that it's somehow connected with vaccinations, for example.
Well, there's not a shred of evidence. If there was some evidence, I might, all the experiments that have been done in large samples have shown absolutely no difference between large groups that have been vaccinated and similar groups that have not been vaccinated with this mercury or thimerosal or whatever. So if there were evidence, sure, but there isn't any. The reason I think that people are suspicious of this, one thing, there's a tremendous desire to, people really want an answer, because it's a terrible thing to have a child, in particular who's severely autistic. It's a terrible thing. And secondly, about 15% of autisms are regressive. It means this, that in about 15% of the cases, a child will seem to be developing normally through roughly the age of 2, and then go backwards, lose language, maybe lose some coordination that he or she had, and so on. It's a regressive type. That happens to be roughly the time at which kids get one of these multi-shots. So a lot of things, oh, well, she was fine until she got that rotten shot. Well, maybe it was a month before or a month after or something like that. But there's no causative connection that anyone has determined between those shots and that behavior. But that would be I mean, look at all the people who still think living by a high tension line, that electromagnetism is going to give you cancer. Now, there's not a shred of evidence of that, but there are still people who say, hey, you know, I don't believe it. They're out to get it. So anyway, I'm sorry I talked too long.
No, that's perfectly fine. Where do we go from here in your fields, your respective fields? Just as a way of sort of wrapping this up, Dr. Yang, where are we going? Where are we headed in physics, for example?
This is a question which is oftentimes raised by my students when they talk to me, because that affects their future very much, of course. I always say that if you look at the history of physics in different periods, there are completely different types of problems, completely different flavor of development. And for a young person looking forward to a future in physics, he or she must understand something about the changing environment. And I especially emphasize what was the situation 1 century ago is no longer the situation today. century ago, there were fundamental problems in physics which need to be solved. And Einstein and Heisenberg were born at that time. So they created the great revolutions. Today, we don't have that opportunity. Does that mean it's bad for you compared with my generation, especially compared with Heisenberg's generation? Yes and no. If you want to make revolutions, I think you are less fortunate. But on the other hand, usually people do not make revolutions. People make small progress, very useful progress, very rewarding progress. And there you have an advantage. Because today, the field of physics is very wide. Many, many doors are open. And if you go into the right door, you might make some very important progress in the field of lasers, in the pace of superconductivity, in what I called this morning about the cold atoms. The technology advance makes it possible for human beings to explore matter in many more ways than it was possible for Einstein's time or for Heisenberg's time. So you should think of this as a challenge and as an opportunity. It's a different type of challenge. But if you ask me, is physics full of important future prospects? I said, of course. And furthermore, in fact, if you do the right thing, you might become a billionaire, because all these new channels, how is the modern computer created? The modern computer depends on the chip. The chip depends on the semiconductor. And semiconductor is a field of physics. And if you do the right thing today in the semiconductor field, for example, if you can make a semiconductor-like device which solves the heat transport problem, you would become immediately the head of you could become immediately the head of a company worth $1 billion. So there are many more opportunities today for you to make achievements of various kinds compared with Heisenberg and Bohr's time. I think, so if you ask me, is physics a good field? Answer is unambiguously yes. Is it a good field for revolutions like Einstein's? No.
Dr. Simons, what advice would you give young mathematicians or young investment advisors? Take your pick.
Well, I'll try to be brief. I think one can summarize some of what Frank is saying, is that he said physics is broader and so is mathematics, in particular on the application side. So I think there'll be a lot of progress in mathematics on the theoretical side, as there always has been, but mathematics and quantitative methods in general are more and more ubiquitous in applying to a whole range of areas. Finance today is riddled with quants. Obviously, a Google didn't even exist 20 years ago, and so on and so forth. So there are many, many opportunities for people in mathematics or with mathematical training, yes, to do great research, but also to do a variety of things. And in another interview, perhaps we could get on to our failures to educate the young people in the country, but it can't be now, because I'm going to go to the 2 o'clock lecture.
I look forward to the next one. Thank you very much, Dr. Simons,
Okay.
and you too, Dr. Young.